If you find any of it confusing, don't worry, because a number of very prominent Bible scholars found parts of that confusing. In fact, Martin Luther said that part of it he didn't understand at all. So, if you're confused, then you may still be confused after this sermon, or at least as confused as I am. As I said, I'm really going to go relatively quickly through this today. Some of it's covering ground that we've covered over the last couple of weeks. We're dealing with a group of people who are under pressure. Now, one of the Bible teachers I looked at pointed out that this is not necessarily the severe persecution that the church faced later. Peter might be talking to Christians who are mistreated or abused or disliked, but they're probably not being murdered and thrown to the lions on all kinds of things that happen to them later. So this is the beginning of abuse, and it's going to get worse for them. But they're under pressure. And I remember a kids' talk from when I was a student at uni. I used to go up to a church in a community, not unlike here actually, a very similar kind of church in a similar kind of place. And I remember a children's talk that the minister did, where he squeezed toothpaste out a tube. You've probably seen this one. And then he talked about how when you're under pressure, what's inside comes out. And he also talked about how you can't put it back in again. But when you're under pressure, what's inside comes out. I suspect what he meant was that when we're under pressure, quite often the bad parts of our character are more prominent. Maybe you've seen it at home. I've had a lot of conversations with people here about how it's easier to be kind and nice and polite and well-mannered at church in the few hours a week we're here or the few hours each day we're here, but it's much harder to be like that all the time. And so holiness is probably most lacking and most obviously challenged at home than it is in public. Because when we're under pressure, when things are difficult at home, when the kids are causing you great trouble, when you're worried about things, when you're able to let go of this kind of facade of doing okay, quite often that's when the pressure gets to you. But maybe in a community which is under pressure because of persecution, maybe they also start to fall apart a little bit. So maybe it's not just you as an individual. Maybe when the church is under pressure, then people stop being quite as kind and quite as loving and quite as patient and holy with one another. And so Peter says to them that that while they're under pressure, they should work really hard to be kind, to be loving. What was the list? So be like-minded, be united, be sympathetic to one another, love one another, be compassionate, and be humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult, but repay evil with blessing. So firstly, Peter sounds like he's talking to them as Christians and telling them to be kind, compassionate, united within the church. When the church is under pressure, when the church is being challenged on the outside, then it's quite easy to start being unpleasant to one another within the church. Not just when it's under pressure, just when you get to know each other. I noticed that here, that as we've been together a long time, most of us. And I watch relationships develop and grow. I watch people become friends. I watch people come from outside the church into the church and become a central part of it. And what quite often happens is that we all start irritating each other. You know, when you first come, you think, oh, this is awesome, and everyone's so friendly. And, Riverside's really good at welcoming new people. But then once you've been here a little while, you start seeing that, well, maybe people aren't quite as kind and friendly and patient as I thought they were. And they start realizing that you're not quite as nice as they thought you were when you first come. And so what happens is, in any community, but in the church as well, as we get deeper and deeper into relationship with one another, we start to annoy each other. And if you add pressure to that, we start to lose patience. We become more like real family. In fact, in terms of Scripture, we are more family than our blood family. We are part of the eternal family of Jesus Christ. So in one sense, we're actually more deeply connected than we are with folk in our own blood families who don't believe. But like any family, we can start to annoy each other. And the longer we spend time together, we can start to notice things that we don't like about one another. So Peter says to them that they should not be repaying evil with evil. If somebody annoys you in the church, then you shouldn't be looking to get back at them. If somebody says something bad about you, then you should repay that with blessing and kindness, is what he says, rather than anger. So, firstly, within the church, we are to work very hard for unity and love and compassion and for forgiveness. We are all annoying people. We're all people who have sinful traits and habits. We all have the tendency towards selfishness. All of us have that. And the more we know each other, the more that will be obvious. And the harder we will have to work to show the unity and the love of Jesus Christ. Secondly, we need to show that to the people outside the church. So Peter moves on to say that to those who are persecuting you, you should return blessing instead of hate. Now, I don't know what you came up with in terms of how you've been mistreated for your faith. I think it's much harder for people in other countries. But sometimes you will have experienced criticism. I bet when you became a Christian and the rest of your family might not have been, they thought you were an idiot. Maybe some of them wanted to distance themselves from you. Maybe in places you've worked, maybe friendships have been affected in very subtle ways. What I also want to say is, in later chapters, Peter's going to talk about that you have an enemy, the devil, who's like a prowling lion. So you may not have physical persecution, you might not get locked up, but I firmly believe that there's an enemy of the church, even here at work. And he works in your mind and your heart as well. So sometimes when I hear about enemies in Scripture, I think about the thoughts, I think about the challenges, I think about the unseen battle that goes on for the Christian. You may not be persecuted by your next door neighbour grassing you up to the police for something, but you may be persecuted by the demonic realm, by evil powers who want to destroy your faith. But in terms of people, in terms of the people who might treat you badly because of your faith, when you're under pressure that way, Peter says to them to show love and compassion, to love their enemies, as Christ had said. And that's a challenge, isn't it? He quotes from Psalm 32 and he talks about essentially what we say and how we should use. Essentially, we should use our mouth for blessing and not for destruction. One of the most powerful things about us is our speech. If you think about it, we're made in the image of God and God spoke and the universe was formed. We have the ability to build up, to create, or to utterly destroy with our mouths. We can hurt people. We can destroy communities. We can cause great damage with our speech. And so, as Christians, one of the most important things is that we bless rather than curse. You need to think about how that plays out in the community. Again, let's go back to, there may be people in this church that irritate you and annoy you. They may have said things you don't like. They may act in a way that you have trouble with. You have a choice to bless or to curse that person. You have a choice to use your language to build up this community or to destroy it a little bit. You have the ability to smooth over with love, because we're all annoying and we've all got difficulties. And, as much as someone irritates you, think of the people you might be irritating in this church family. We have the choice to destroy or to build up with our words. And it's very important. Peter says that we choose love and compassion to build up. So when the church is under pressure, we should be building up, not destroying with our language. He's moving through. So we've talked about within the community under pressure. We've talked about the community's relationship with those outside when we're under pressure. But he talks about suffering in general. And he says that suffering communicates. This is one of the confusing bits because it could mean different things. One interpretation of ministering to the spirits in the time of Noah, right? Which, this is the bit where Martin Luther's saying, and lots of other Bible scholars interpret different ways. But one of the interpretations is that through Noah, do you remember the story? If you don't remember Noah, you might remember Bruce Almighty, or Evan Almighty, sorry. Do you remember Noah is building a boat when there's no water? It's kind of the same in Evan Almighty too. He's building a boat when there's no water and everybody thinks he's crazy. Now, apparently in other non-biblical texts of the time, it talked more about that, the abuse that Noah got, the criticism. Imagine if you started building a boat on the North Inch right now, a huge boat, because you thought there was going to be a flood. You'd be in front of the courier, people would come to laugh at you, kids would come and shout at you, they'd think you're mad. But one of the interpretations is that through the actions of Noah, Christ preached. The Spirit of Christ preached to the people who were perishing. So one of the interpretations, through Noah standing out in his society, acting in a different way from everybody else, through Noah's what seemed like crazy actions of faith, the gospel is proclaimed to people. When you withstand suffering for your faith, when you live differently to those around about you and they criticize you for it, one of the things that's happening is you are communicating the gospel. You are following Christ's example, you're following Noah's example, and you are communicating to those who criticize you the difference that God makes in your life, the difference that Jesus makes in your life. So when we are suffering, and we are suffering well for the gospel, then we communicate to those who do not yet believe. We communicate to them the good news of Jesus Christ. When we suffer, secondly, when we suffer, not only do we follow the example of Jesus Christ, but we share in what he has done. So your suffering doesn't save you, but Jesus' suffering provided salvation. And when you believe and are baptized, you are not just baptized into the church, you're baptized into the life of Jesus and the death of Jesus too. So through baptism, we join with what Jesus did. We are joined with his death and his resurrection. Baptism is a symbol, but it's also an act of joining us with our Father in heaven and with what Jesus has done. And so not only does your suffering communicate and testify to the community round about you, your suffering joins you to what Jesus has done. And Jesus has had victory over all those who criticize him. Jesus has had victory over all the powers of darkness. So let me bring a strand together. You may not be experiencing persecution from people or from the government or you might not be getting taken away and beaten and imprisoned. But I do believe you have a spiritual enemy at work trying to destroy the church, trying to destroy you, trying to destroy your faith, trying to take away the joy you have in Jesus Christ. As you stand firm in suffering, you communicate the truth of the gospel to other people, but you also have the promise that you will overcome this because Christ overcome all the powers of darkness and evil, and you were baptized into him, so you share in his death and resurrection. You have victory over the darkness, and all the things that persecute you, you have victory over it because you share in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Another interpretation of these spirits in prison that Jesus ministered to, I don't know if this is the right one, but another one is actually in this category rather than the other one. So one interpretation is that Noah preaches the gospel through his actions to the people. Another one is that Jesus Christ, after he died, went to proclaim his victory over all those who were already cast into the darkness because they had not believed. And it's not people, it's spirits. So one interpretation is that when the risen Jesus, or before Jesus comes back, but the dead now risen Jesus goes to proclaim his victory over the spirits of darkness that were working the world in the time of Noah. I don't know if that's the right one either. But I do know that Christ has had victory over all of the darkness through his death and resurrection, and that belongs to you because you are baptized into him. So suffering communicates the gospel to those around about you. Suffering connects you to the suffering of Jesus Christ, which is the suffering that has saved you. And lastly, suffering and difference. This kind of summarizes what I've said. At the final paragraph we read, Peter says, if you're willing to suffer, then that shows that you have left your old life behind. If you're willing to stand up to the scorn, not all of you will have had this experience, but many of you will have had the experience that you have changed your life. That coming to faith has changed how you live. And that some of the people that you were friends with before, some of your families, may think there's something wrong because you no longer join in with the things you used to join in with. But Peter says, if you are willing to be different from the community around about you, if you are willing to be different in such a way that people will criticize you for it, if you're willing to be different so that people think you're mad because of your faith, then your willingness to accept that suffering for being different shows that you have left the old life behind. Let me just remember what he says at the very end. He finishes off by saying that those who criticize you will have to give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is the reason the gospel was preached even to those who are now dead, so they might be judged according to human standards in regard to the body, but live according to God in regard to the spirit. So it really just reiterates some of the point I've already made. If you are willing to suffer and to stand out and to be different and to leave your old life behind, this shows that you have moved on in faith, that you're a new person. And although that may challenge the people round about you, although they may persecute or criticize although you may be distanced or estranged from people because of that, it actually speaks to them about the truth of what you believe. The truth that this does matter. Because the risen Jesus Christ will judge all of our actions. Your willingness to live in a different way testifies to the truth that all of us sit under God's judgment and must, by faith, accept the forgiveness and the victory over darkness that Jesus has won. Let's pray.